Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing the topic of magic methods again, which, as we learned in our constructors lesson, is a special type of method in PHP. We're going to be specifically getting into a little more details about what magic methods actually are in PHP. We've used them before when we talked about a constructor. That's a magic method in PHP, but now we're going to sort of provide a more formal definition of that. We're going to talk about what are known as destructors, which in PHP is a special magic method. Then we're going to talk about three different magic methods in PHP: underscores toString, underscore get, and underscore set. And then we're also going to talk about the concept of access modifiers, which relates to declaring, for example, all of our properties and functions so far have had the public keyword listed before them. So we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is and how we're going to change that. And then in general, we're going to finish up talking about using getters and setters in general, which are ways to get and set properties of a particular object. So in PHP, any method that basically starts with this, which is a double underscore, are known as magic methods. And basically, anytime you create an object or a class file, you shouldn't create any methods that begin with an underscore, because PHP sort of reserves the right to, in the future, use those as magic methods. In particular, you wouldn't want to name, for example, we know construct is a magic method. So you wouldn't want to define your own construct method in a PHP class unless you're actually planning on using it as a constructor, because otherwise PHP is going to treat it as a constructor, and it's not going to be something you could sort of run on your own. Magic methods are special in that they're automatically called by PHP. For example, we know a constructor, whenever you use a new statement, for example, new item, pass it some data, this construct method is implicitly called by PHP. It's automatically called by PHP, and that's why you don't want to name methods construct, because then, for example, if you had an item object, you wouldn't really be able to call that construct method. And there are a number of different magic methods that are available to objects in PHP, and we're going to be talking about a number of those different ones that are available in today's lesson. So first of all, I want to talk about a concept of a destructor. It's sort of the analog to a constructor. A constructor is called automatically when a new instance of an object is created. Now, on the other hand, when an instance of an object is destroyed, which means that it essentially means that it's no longer being used anymore, you can have a method called a destructor that's called, and basically what that sort of does is it's used to clean up any object state before the object is essentially destroyed. So, for example, maybe you have some open files that were used by a particular object. By having this destructor method that always gets called, and it's something that if you define it always gets called automatically by PHP, then you can ensure that all your files will always be closed, which is a good practice so that you don't have file locking issues and stuff like that. That's just one particular example, but it basically allows you to do any sort of, allows you to run any code that you'd like to run every time an object is sort of destroyed before its lifetime ends. And it's automatically called any time an object is no longer being used. So, for example, when the script ends, or if an object is explicitly set to not be used, which means you can call the unset method, or you explicitly set it to null. That's basically telling PHP you don't need that object anymore. When that occurs, the destructor is automatically called. In PHP, destructors are magic methods, and they have a name similar to construct, except it's double underscore destruct. And it's within this method that you can define any operations or code that you'd like to occur whenever an object is destroyed or gets destructed by PHP. So, for example, let's take a look at, we have a class here called DataFile that we're going to sort of be building up during this lecture. And what DataFile is a class that's going to sort of encapsulate all the things that we do for a file. For example, we use fopen, fclose, and fwrite to open, write, and close a particular file. What we're going to do is we're sort of going to wrap that functionality into this object called DataFile. And what we're going to do for example, is for each data file object, we're going to give it a file name and an access mode. And then what you can do is after you create this data file object, you can run an open function on it, which we're going to see. Then you can run a write operation on it and a close operation on it. And basically those open and close operations are calling basically underneath the service contained within the object's code, these fopen, fgets, fclose methods, and so forth. So that's what our data file class is going to be used for. It's to represent access to a data file. In this first version, we're just going to give it one property called a public property called file name. And as you can see here, we have our function, our constructor function, which is a magic method that takes one parameter, and it basically just sets the value of our file name property. We also have an echo statement here, and this is going to be used to kind of show how PHP is working behind the scenes. That basically just says, okay, we're in the data file constructor. And then here's a new magic method, the destruct method. And it just simply outputs a message that says we're in the destructor. We're actually going to be improving on this so that this destructor method will actually close any open files that we may have open. But for now, we're just going to output a message so you can see at what point during a particular script the destructor gets called. So for example, we include our data file class in this particular script called destructor.php. We output a message that says before the object is created. Then we call the constructor, which is implicitly going to call the construct method. So we should see an output message, that output message from our construct method we defined. Then we output a message stating that this is the last statement in the script, and then the script ends. And then what we should notice, or will notice, is that actually another statement gets output. It's the statement that's saying we're in the destructor, because when the script ends, basically the lifetime of this data file object that we created in the script is no more, and it's going to be destroyed, and so PHP automatically calls the destruct method. So if we run this particular version of destructor.php, we can see we have a statement, but this is before the object is created. The next thing that happens is you're inside the constructor. Then you can see that we execute the last statement in the script, and yet even though we've executed the last statement in the script, we actually have another piece of output, and it says inside the data file destructor. So that shows you that when that script ends, if any objects are still haven't been destroyed yet, they actually destructors still get called, and so code is actually even running even though we're not in the script anymore. An alternative version to that is here we have the same data file class in this new version, but what we're going to do is instead we're going to say the output the message says this is before the object is created. We're going to call its constructor, and then we're going to explicitly destroy the object by null, which by setting it equal to null, which, as we mentioned on the slide, is essentially going to call that destruct method because the object exists no more. So what's going to happen is because the destructor gets called here, that message that says you're in the destructor is going to get output before we actually get to this last output statement within our script. So the order of those last two statements are going to change. So if we go over here to version 2 of this, now we can see the output before the object is created. We're inside the constructor, we're inside the destructor, and then we execute the last statement in the script. And the reason that in data file destructor doesn't occur afterwards as well is because the object has already been destroyed. It's already had its destruct method called, and it was called when we set it equal to null. So here in this case, when the last statement of the script ends, the script actually ends in that particular case, and no destructors get called. Oops. So in this, basically what we're going to do now is have an updated version. It looks like here it is. This is version 3.0 of our data file class, and basically I'm going to show you how I've updated it because we're going to be using it throughout the rest of the lecture. I've basically added a couple more properties to it. I've added an access mode property, which is basically says this. You can set the access mode for which you want to open this particular file, this data file object is going to represent. There's a variable called file handle, which is going to basically hold a reference to the open file once it's that this data file class represents. And we're going to use that in the different methods within this class definition to open the file, close the file, write to it, and so forth. Here in the constructor, it takes two. You can see the constructor's been updated. It takes two parameters, one to set the file name of the file that this is going to represent, and then also the access mode we're going to want to open it in. And then we initialize the file handle initially to null. Then if you look down here, we can see that we have an open method, and it's a object method that you can call after you create an instance of the object. And basically what it does is it just opens the file that we've specified using the access mode we've specified, and then sets the object property file handle equal to the file handle that returns. Then we've created another object method called append line, which is going to allow us to append a line to the data file this object represents, and it uses the fwrite method. And what we actually make use of is the file handle that we've created up here in the open class. And then it basically just writes whatever string we pass to append line to this file handle. Finally, there's a close method, and first thing it does is it outputs an echo statement that says we're in close, and you're going to see why we're doing that in a second. It's mainly for educational purposes. It wouldn't be something we'd normally do. And then you can see we just use the fclose method within this close method, objects close method, and it basically closes the open file that's pointed to by this file handle object property, and then we go ahead and we set the file handle object property equal to null. There's a reason for that. So what we actually have is our destructor has changed a little bit. We have a message that shows we're in the destructor. But what it does is we use the destructor to basically close an open file if to close the file that this data file object represents if it has not been closed yet. So basically what it does is it checks to see if the file handle is not equal to null, and if it's not equal to null, it goes ahead and runs this object's close method, which as we saw is down here. And as we can see in the object close method again, the last thing that it does is sets the file handle to null. So when the destructor is called and it runs this test, this file handle not equal to null, that's sort of its way of knowing whether the file has already been closed. If it has already been closed, it doesn't do anything. If it hasn't been closed, it goes ahead and closes this method. And this is our way of sort of cleaning up this this data file object to make sure that any open files, or the open file that it has been properly closed. And let me open up. Looks like I accidentally closed one of the files. If we look at destructor.php, this new version, basically we're including our data file class that we just talked about. We're creating a path to a temporary file. In this case, it's just going to be a file called temp.txt in the current directory. And then we're going to create a new data file object using that data file constructor we just talked about, which takes the file name that we want to basically open, and then the method that we're going to use to open it in, which in this case the access mode is going to be overwrite mode. Then we call the open method, which is going to call that fopen function. It's going to open the file and set that local, or set the object variable file handle. We're going to append a line to it. In this case, we're just simply going to append a date timestamp with a new line, and then we're going to call the close method on it to basically close that data file, and then our script is going to end. So in this particular order, when we run this script, we can see a couple of things. We can say, if you remember, we had an output statement in our close method that says we're in the close method, and we had an output statement in our destructor method that says we're in the destructor method. In this case, you can see that inclose has been output first, and that's because in our file, close was explicitly called, so that output statement that's in close gets executed, and then the file ends, the script ends down here, and when the file ends, the destructor automatically gets called. When the destructor gets called, it's going to output that statement that it has in it that says inside data file constructor, and that is why that statement is output last. Now let's say that instead in our main script we didn't call the close function. So let's say somebody had written a script and they didn't properly close, they didn't know how to use our data file object appropriately, and so they opened it, they appended a line to it, but they didn't call the close. Well, what's going to happen is when the script ends, the destructor is going to get called for this class, and because close hasn't occurred yet, our destructor is going to get run, and it knows to close the file if it's not been opened yet. So what you're going to see is that the destructor is going to get called, so you're going to see that you're in the destructor method, and then when we look at our destructor method, we can see that it also calls the close method. So actually then you're going to see this output statement that shows the close method is being run. So actually these statements that we last saw were going to be reversed, whereas before we got the close method and then we're in the destructor method. Now it's going to be reversed because close was never called, the destructor gets called, and then the destructor, because the file is still open, calls the close method. So when we do that and refresh our page, we can see that they're reversed. So we're actually in the destructor, and the destructor, because the file is still open, it's going to call the inclose method. And so that's basically a common example of how to use an object destructor to make sure that basically any sort of cleanup work that you need to get done before an object is destroyed, it actually gets done. So another magic method that all objects can create is called underscore toString. And basically what that does is that is called anytime you reference an object in a string context. For example, if let's say you create a new variable A and you set it equal to an item, or you create a new instance, you set it equal to an instance of an item object. Well, anytime you were to use use that object variable in a string context, for example here within an echo statement, this toString method is going to get called automatically if it exists. And if it exists, it allows you to basically say how you want to output the particular object as a string. So for example, for an item, we might have it output as its string the name of the item. So whenever you'd run echo name, let's say we had an item object, that's an item class that's different from our web application. It just takes one parameter that's the name of the item. So now when you would go to echo A, which you're basically saying I want to echo this item object, the toString method is going to get automatically called by PHP, and that's because it's a magic method. And then what you'd actually get output would be the string basketball, which would be the name of the object, assuming our toString method returns the name of the item as the string that it wants to represent the object as. So what you can do in this toString method is represent an object in whatever string form you want to represent it as. So let me close some of these files. So in this example, we have it called toString.php. And it's basically the same as our last script example, except that we're not calling any open or write operations or close operations on the particular object. We're just creating a new data file object, calling it and having it create a file or represent a temp.txt file, a file called temp.txt. And then what we're actually going to do is we're going to use the object within a string context. So we're going to just include the variable that holds the object instance of data file, and when we put it in double quotes, PHP is going to know to call a toString method on that object, assuming one exists. Well, we've actually updated our data file class to include a toString method, and because we define this method, we can describe how we want our a data file object to be represented as a string. In this case, our string that we're going to return is simply the name of the file, followed by a colon, and then followed by the access mode within single quotation marks. So anytime you use, you call, or you include a data file object within a string context, within an echo statement, within another string, the toString is going to be automatically or implicitly called by PHP, and it's going to output the name of the file, followed by a colon, followed by the access mode. So if we go and look at this in action and we run the toString script, we can see that our data file object is a string when its output is a string, and we can see here that we include it in these HTML pre-tags. So here we've included our df, which is our object that represents a data file. It's going to call the toString method, and as you can see, what it does is it outputs the name of the file that object represents, followed by a colon, followed by the W. And basically, we can do whatever we want within that toString method to output a data file class. For example, maybe we just want to include the file name. So if we change this, now anytime we reference df, or anytime we use an object, a data file object within a string context, it's only going to output the file name. And here you can see the W is gone. And again, you can do whatever you want within this method. We could simply, even if we wanted to, just say data file object. And now when we run this, it's just going to simply output the string data file object every time we try to use data file object as a string within a string. So that's how the toString method works. Now, one thing I want to talk about is something known as access modifiers, and basically what that refers to is all object properties and methods basically have what's known as a visibility associated with them, which describes where they can be accessed from. For example, all of our properties we've declared so far in all of our classes have been declared public. They have public visibility. They use the public access modifier. So if we look at our data file, one of our data file classes, we can see that we've used this public keyword here before all of our properties. Now what that does is that basically says that means that anybody outside that class has access to that property. They can get or set that property. You can also access it within inside the class using this variable. Now on the other hand, you could declare something as private. And that basically means that it's only accessible within the class definition file. So you can only access it using this within any methods within the class definition file. If you try to access it, for example, in your script, if you try to access a private method, you're going to get an error from PHP. There's one other access modifier called protected, which we're not going to go over, which basically says that any property that's listed as protected is accessible inside the class definition, which means inside any of the methods within the class, or by inherited classes. And we're not going to be going over inheritance in this course, so it doesn't really apply. So we're just going to be talking about public and private access modifiers in this course. Basically, the reason that you declare something as private is to facilitate an object-oriented sort of method called data encapsulation. And basically what it does is if you declare all of your properties of a particular object private, that means that any code outside of that object can't go ahead and directly change those. And so one of the sort of foundations of object-oriented programming is that as the object should be able to control and know everything about its state, all of its values, and make sure that it's kept in a consistent state. That's why in our constructor, for example, we initialize all of the values in our constructor. Initialize all of our object's properties in the constructor so that our object is in a known state. Now, if, all of our objects we've used so far actually have had a public access modifier, which means that code outside the object could run it. So, for example, when we had talked about in our last web application, we talked about the items. For example, the items array that's part of our department object. In our constructor for a department object, we explicitly set that equal to an empty array, so that anytime it's attempted to be accessed, it's accessed as an array and will be treated as an array. That's how we want our class to function. However, because that class is actually, or items is actually declared public at the beginning of the file, anybody outside the class, if they have a reference to this department class, for example, maybe they have a department object called department, they could go ahead and set items equal to the empty string or any other string. So now our object is sort of in an inconsistent state. It has this items property that's supposed to be an array, but now it has now it can be set to a string. So our object methods that might count on the fact that that object is that items property is an array might not work. So the way we sort of handle this is by keeping all of the data in a particular class private, and then that way, anytime you need to set, for example, pieces of data, either have to do a constructor, which is going to allow you to make sure that only valid values get set, or through what are known as setter methods or any other object methods that you describe. So basically, anytime you want to touch the state, which is basically the values of the properties of an object, you have to go through an object's methods, and that allows you to keep control over that data within that class. One other thing is that methods can also be declared public or private, and they have sort of the same functionality that we described up here for object properties. If a object method is public, it can be used outside of the class. For example, on our department class, we have a public method called addItem, where we pass it an item ID. That's a public method. However, you can also declare a method as private, which means that it can only be used within the class. So if we declare a method as private, for example, if we declared addItem as private, when we tried to call this outside of the class definition, you'd get an error. So basically, if a method's private, the only way it can be called is by using the this modifier, the this special variable, and then calling the function. So this applies for methods as well. So let's take a look at what a public version of our class looks like. In this case, it's exactly the file that we had before. We have all of our properties declared as public, all of our methods. In this case, we have the 3 non-magic methods, close, append line, and open. They're all declared as public. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create in our script a new instance of this data file. And then we're going to show that we can actually go ahead and set our object property values using the regular accessor syntax because those properties are declared public. If they're private, we wouldn't be able to do this. So we're going to basically set the file name to change it from what it was set in a constructor to index.html. We're going to set the access mode to R. And then down here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to access these values. Because these values are public, or these properties are public, you can use the regular accessor syntax in order to access those values from outside the class. So here we're going to access the file name in access mode, and we're going to output that. So when we run our script, we should get no problems, and we should be able to set those values and then output them. And here, as you can see, we were obviously able to set them because when we output them, they were output to the new values that we had specified, index.html and R, which is opposed to what they were initially set to, which was W and temp file. So as you can see, when properties are public, you have the ability to get and set them from outside of a class. Now, as an alternative to that, we have a sort of private version of our data file class where we've declared all of our object properties with the access modifier private, which means they only can be accessed from within the class. And for example, you can see down here that they're able to be accessed using the this variable because that's within a function within the class. And the reason for that is because they're accessible within the class definition. You can access it with any of the class methods. However, if we try to do the same thing that we did before, we declare a new data file object, and this is this new version of the data file with the private properties, and then we try to set those private properties. For example, we try to set the file name to index.html, and we try to run this new file called private.php. What we can see is we get an error, fatal error. Cannot access private property data file name. So that shows how you're not able to set those properties, set private properties using this regular accessor syntax, and that's because they were declared private. So let's get rid of these. And now let's try down here, we're going to try to output or to get the values of these private properties. We're going to try to get the file name property. We're going to try to get the the access mode property, or the values of those properties, and then output them, just as we had done before. Now, because they're private, we shouldn't be able to do this, so when we run our script, we're going to get a new message that says, fatal error, cannot access private property data file name, and it's saying on line 38. So actually, if we go back and look at line 38, we can see here, this is where we've tried to access this private object property from outside the class. So that shows how you can't get private properties from outside the class as well. Now, the other thing that we've done is we've declared this open function just temporarily for illustrative purposes. We've declared it as private, which means it's only accessible within the class definition. So for example, you can only access it within other object methods, for example, like here. This would work okay. Oops. Let me save it back to its original state. So now this is declared private. Down here, when we try to call this private method, we're going to get an error because it's going to say you can't call that method. It's a private method, only accessible within the class. So when we refresh this page, fatal error, called a private method, data file open. So again, that shows you that when something, basically this illustrates how that private access modifier on object properties and on object methods affects your ability to access the properties and call those methods from outside a particular class. So now that we've created these properties as private, and we've said that you should keep your object properties private, you want to basically protect them and make sure that they stay in an appropriate state. Well, sometimes you're going to need to access those properties. You're going to need, for example, in this particular case, maybe we want to get the name of the particular file. Well, PHP provides another magic method called underscore get, underscore get, and what that does is that allows you to access these private properties. And basically what it does is you pass anytime, for example, let's say we've been using our new data file class that has file name property declared as private. And we want to set it outside. Actually, we're using get. We want to echo it. When we tried to do this before, we got an error. It says the file name is a private property. However, if we define a get, this magic method get, anytime PHP encounters you trying to access a private object property, it's going to invoke this get method that you can define, and it's going to allow you the ability to provide access to those private property values if you want. And so basically it gives you access to these private properties, and this is the only way to access those private properties, assuming that you don't have any other public methods that allow you to access those properties, which we're going to see a little bit more of in a future slide. So for example, if we look at a new version of datafile.php, we've declared this magic method get, and here we output a statement that basically says that we're inside this get method. So basically that's going to let us know when PHP is invoking this method, because what we're going to see in our code is that we never actually call this method. We never actually call df underscore get with some value. It's done automatically by PHP, and that's how magic methods work. So this is going to let us know when underscore get is being called. And basically what our get method does is it basically takes the name of a property as its parameter, and then it allows you, because this function has access to private properties, it can use this variable to access whatever property we want that we pass into this get magic method. Basically what happens is anytime you try to access a private property, for example, here, like df dash greater than file name, it's essentially what PHP is doing is calling our get method that we defined, and we're passing it the value file name. That's essentially what's happening behind the scenes. So in our get method that we've defined, which takes one parameter, which is the name of the property we want to get, what it does is it takes that name and then it basically just returns the value of that. So this is going to allow us to have access to private properties. So for example, in this get.php script, it's going to show that this is the same script that we had before where we're trying to access private properties, but they're going to work now because we've defined this get method that allows us to access inaccessible or private properties of an object. So now when we run this script, which is now called get.php, we can see that, well, a couple things. First of all, we can see that we're in this get method, this get magic method, which is interesting because we never actually call that get method. And again, PHP automatically calls that anytime you try to access a private variable using this accessor syntax, and that variable and the variable's private, and you have defined that get method. So again, this is a magic method, so it gets called automatically. So we can see that we're in get method twice. We're in once when we try to get the file name, and now we're able to actually get the file name that we've set for this particular object, and then we're also able to get the access mode. So this get magic method allows us access to private properties. Well, there's an analog to this called __set, which is another magic method. Basically performs, works in the same way, except that it allows you to set the values of private properties. Allows you to set the value which are considered inaccessible. So normally, when we looked at, when we had our old version of the script, so let's take a look at it. Oops. Let's look at version 5. When we try to access private properties before, or when we try to set private properties before, it works when they're public, but it doesn't work when they're private. Well, this set methods are going to allow us to change that. Basically what you do is you define the set method that's going to work the same way as anytime you try to set a method using the accessor syntax, for example. Equals just .txt is the name of the file. Anytime we try to do this, if file name is private, anytime PHP sees this accessor syntax going on, because it's a private variable, it's going to go ahead and it's going to invoke this set magic method. The set magic method, by definition, has two variables or two parameters that it takes. One is name and one is value. And you can set them to whatever name you want, but that's essentially what they represent. The first one, and basically what it does is name describes is the name of the property that you want to set. So in this case, when we try to access this up here, what we're actually going to be doing is calling df set. We're going to be passing it file name, which is the name of the property we're going to set. And then here, this is the value we're trying to set it to, so it also takes a value parameter. So this is essentially how this set this set magic method works. It takes the name of the object property you want to set and the value, and then it allows you to go ahead and set them. And it allows you to define the way you want to do that. And also, one thing to mention is that it allows you, for example, to maybe perform some error checking. Maybe you don't want to let a file called .txt be set for this particular file. So you can, within your set method, you can say if the value equals .txt to don't do it. So this basically allows you to have control again over access to these private properties. So for example, if we go look at our new data file class, we still have all of our private object properties. We have our get magic method. Now we have our set magic method, and again it takes two values, the name of the property we want to set and the value. And in this case, anytime this method is called, and it's going to get called automatically by PHP, we're saying whatever the name of the property is that we pass to this, implicitly pass to this set magic method. We're going to set the value of this object's property that has that name to the value that we pass in. So as we saw in our example, in this case, set would set the file name. When we call this up here, when we try to run this code up here, basically we're going to be calling the set method with file name as the property name and then .txt as the value we're trying to set it to. One other thing to note is that we've also included a statement here that shows when we actually are in the set method, and that's again to show how PHP implicitly calls it. So if we look at our file set.php, we declare a new data file instance. We set it equal to a temporary file name temp.txt, and we give it a w access modifier. Now we're going to try and set these private object properties, the file name and the access mode, in this case to index.html and R. So what's going to happen is because we've declared this set magic method, we're going to be able to do that now. It's going to provide us the ability to set those private properties. So when we go to run this new version, we're going to see we're going to see two things. It's going to say, okay, it's in set, and it's setting, basically it says what property it's setting. Here it's going to be setting the file name. Here it's going to be setting the access mode. Because these set methods don't return anything, we're not outputting what it gets set to. We're just saying that when we're in this method, it's going to output and say this is the name of the value that we're trying to set. So in this particular case, it's going to set it equal to index.html and R. And then actually, if we wanted to, we could echo these. Let's just echo the file name, for example. Because we have our get magic method defined, and we should be able to see that it actually outputs the value that we were able to set, actually outputs the new value that we set the file name object property to, and we were able to do that because we had defined this set method. Now, one thing to note is that the set method allows you to actually create properties or to dynamically add properties to an object instance, which often is undesirable, and in most cases is. So for example, because we have this set method, we actually could go ahead and add another property essentially to our data file class. Let's create an object property called fake, and we'll set it equal to fake value. Now, because this set method works, the other thing that these get and set magic methods do is not only does it allow access to private properties, but if you try to access, if you try to set a property that doesn't exist or get a property that doesn't exist, it also is going to call that get or set method and provide it, in this case, the name of the property you're trying to set, and then also the value. In this case, down here, if we echo fake, this is going to say it's going to try to return the value of the property fake. And it's going to allow that because when we look at our code, well, for example, when we call set first, we're going to be able to say, basically what this is going to do is create this new property fake and set it equal to the value we set it to, and then this is going to allow us, because we've set it, to access that value. So for example, if we try to create this new property, object property fake, and then we try to output it, and we run our file again, we can see that we're setting the fake variable, so that setter method was called, and then we're also able to access that variable, that object property. So in a sense, we've added a property to our object, and that's something that you're typically not going to want to do. So this set method is typically used in certain more advanced circumstances. But I did want to show that to you because you will see that used in code that's out there, for example, in frameworks and different projects on the web. The alternative to using these get and set magic method is to actually create your own public getter and setter methods, and there are also ways to provide access to private properties. So for example, we can define a new data file class, with private properties. But now for each property, we're going to define getters and setters. We're going to define a public function, which means it's accessible to everybody, that says get file name. And when it's called on this particular object, it's going to return the value of this private variable file name. And the reason it can do that is because within this function, you have access to the values of these private variables. So this way, we've basically provided a way to get the value of the private file name variable. We provided a way to get the access mode variable. And as you can see, we actually create a separate method for each one. So that's one way to do it, and it's something you might see out there. And typically, the sort of the nomenclature you use for doing that is you call the method get, starting with a lowercase g, followed by the name of the variable you're trying to get, and it uses upper camel case notation. So, for example, here file name is capitalized. Here access mode, the first letters of each are capitalized. Similarly, you can define set functions that typically are called set, followed by the name of the property you're trying to set, and they take the value you want to set it to, and then basically within the function all they do is they access that private variable and set it to the value passed in. So as you can see, well, in this script, there's no underscore get or underscore set method, so theoretically we shouldn't automatically be able to access those variables. And in fact, in this new file, gettersetters.php, let's say here we're just creating our data file as we had been in our other scripts. Let's say that we try to access file name. Now this is something that's been declared private, and when we try to use this, PHP is going to look for that underscore get magic method. If it doesn't find it, it's not going to allow you to access. If it does find it, it'll allow you to output that private property if you want. We haven't defined it in this class, so actually when we call this now, try to run this new script, we can see that it can't access private property. So let's go ahead and get rid of this line. And then what you can see down here is we've actually made use of these getters and setters that we've created. They're these new methods. So instead of here of saying file using the accessor syntax dash greater than and then the name of the property, we're using these public functions that we created in order to set these private variables. So we're actually going to set the file name to index.html, the access mode equal to R, which is different than the values that were set in the constructor. And then we're going to use these getters we've defined, these public methods, to output, to access those private variables, file name and access mode. So when we go to output them, we should see that file name had been set to index.html, and therefore it'll get output, and the access mode had been set to R, so it's going to get output. So now when we refresh our file, we can see that, in fact, that's what happens. File name has been set to index.html, and access mode has been set to R. So what you can see is that these setter methods that we've defined allow us to set private properties, and then these getters that we've defined allow us to get access to private properties as well without using the get and underscore set magic methods provided by that you can provide that PHP will call automatically for you. So typically you'll might use a combination of the underscore get, underscore set, and any public setters and getters you define to provide the ability to get access to an object's properties. The way we're typically going to do in this course is we're going to be using the get method to provide access to private properties, and instead of providing this set method, because that allows you to add properties to an object, which is not really typically a desired feature, we're going to for any properties that we want to be able to private properties we want to be able to set, we're going to define some public setter methods, and so that's sort of what we're going to use in this course, and that's basically to set any private properties. And I just want to mention that in general, it's good practice to allow other code to only be able to get and set private properties when it's necessary. You don't want them to be able, for example, you could provide a set. Let's say you have a class with 10 different properties. You could provide a setter method called set x, with x being the name of the property, that would take a value for all 10 of your properties. But unless you really need the other code to be able to do that, you don't want to do that. And again, that's sort of that idea of data encapsulation and protection, that you want to be able to have control over your data. So you don't really want people setting the data, particularly setting the data if they don't need to be. And then also you don't want them to be able to get the data as often because typically with object-oriented programming, the object should be able to provide any functions it needs. So for example, when you call a get method on a function, you're basically saying, give me a property and I'm going to do something with it. Well, one of the sort of methodologies behind object-oriented programming is that the object should be able to do any functionality associated with it. So if you're getting that file name, for example, to do something with it, maybe you should define a method within your data file object, for example, that does whatever operation this other code may be trying to do. So for the homework challenge, I want you to create a person class that has two private properties, first name and last name, and then provide a constructor that accepts no arguments, but it initializes both of these properties to the empty string. Then provide a destructor that simply just outputs a message that says, hey, I'm in the destructor. Provide a toString method, which is a magic method that when you use a person object in a string context, it's just going to output the first name and the last name properties of the person separated by a space. So it's basically going to output their full name. Create a get method, magic method, that allows you to access the private properties of the private first name and last name properties of the person class. And then provide a public setter method. So instead of providing a set method to be able to set both of these private properties, provide public setter methods for each one. So for example, one of them would be called set first name for the first name property. Then create a script that instantiates a person object. Use these public setter methods that we just described to set the person's first name and last name properties. And then using the accessor syntax, go ahead and output the value of both of those properties, the first name and last name that you had set. That's going to show you that, well, first of all, this is going to show you how to use public setter methods. Then when you try to access it, it's going to show you that that setter methods actually worked, assuming they've been implemented correctly. And then what this is going to show you is that when you use this accessor syntax on private properties, PHP is automatically going to call that get method that we define that allows you to get access to those properties. Then I just want you to output the person object as a string by basically just including it in double quotes, echo, and then double quotes with the object. And what that's going to do is convert it to a string, which means PHP is going to implicitly call that toString method, so that full name should be output. Then what I want you to do is unset the person object using the unset construct in PHP, where you just provide it, for example, if it's a data file object called df, you just provide it the name of the variable. What that's going to do is unset the variable, set it to null, it's going to destroy the variable, that's going to implicitly call the destructor, and then allow you to see that destructor message. So basically just verify that you're able to output the first and last name properties that you set using the public setter methods as you expect, that the toString method will actually output the person's full name, and that after you call this unset method, that the destructor actually gets called, and you can see that by the message you have in your destructor being output on the screen. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.